Um, so what I will do today is to essentially present the book. And I will spare you definitions of populism and a review of the literature, simply because we are now possibly in at least the 20th year of populist research. My first book on populism was published in 2007, and it was about populism and Berlusconi and right-wing populist parties in Italy. So we have, a long history of populist research. So what is new and what is interesting and what should we talk about when we talk about populism today is the subject of my presentation today. So if we skip the debate on the origins and definitions of populism, what we see today that is interesting and new is the fact that populist parties and movements used to be the challengers until recently. They had very small percentages in the electorate and a very small presence in parliaments. And very often they frame themselves as social movements, as political challengers. What is happening today, however, is very different. A lot of these parties and movements are large. In many countries, they are now in government, either as main government incumbent party or as members of coalitions, of right-wing coalitions. This has altered, has changed their functions, their roles, and a lot of the literature on populism doesn't seem to make this transition, this difference from what populism used to be and what populism is today. And this is particularly relevant today, meaning in the last few months after the election of Donald Trump. Simply because if you think about populism as an international movement of ideas, then the Trump election really is very important. The United States is the richest, the most important country in the West, and therefore the issue of the institutionalization of populism is particularly topical and relevant. So let me start by saying briefly what we should look at in general, and then I will look at what different chapters in the book do, and I will then conclude with what the book doesn't do, because it has been published a few months ago, so things have changed now, and there are new developments. So briefly, essentially, populists in governments means that they had to tame, to redefine their arguments and their communication strategies. They used to be bombastic. They used to call for unconstitutional changes. They cannot do that now because in many countries they are in power, and simply they cannot advocate for policies that are unconstitutional. However, what they still do is they haven't changed very often their goals, and their goals very often have to do with limiting minority rights, different minorities, and then the different minorities will change from place to place. There would be sexual minorities in some countries, such as, for instance, in Southern Europe, but maybe not so much in Northern European countries. They are generally migrants. They are ethnic groups, but they would be different in different countries. The Romas in some places and other minorities in other places. So their enemy is more or less still the same. They now increasingly concentrate on eroding the rule of law, which is what this book is about. And this is the reason why I joined the effort with Lisa Antonioli, who is an academic lawyer and can provide a specific lawyer view of what the problem is. Eroding the rule of law means different things, but among them means trying to control the judiciary and limiting the power of social groups that they might consider enemies or disruptive elements, such as NGOs or such as the free press or other social movements. So how do they do that, and what do they do in particular? Well, they very often take on what we call the chameleon aspect. In other words, they act still very much as disruptive elements in the public sphere, and at the same time, they're much more moderate in parliaments. So they speak different languages in different arenas. They try to control enemies by the levers of power that they now hold, such as funding for civil society organizations, the independence of the media, and changing the constitution to limit the power of the judiciary. And we have seen this in many different forms in different countries. They do another thing that is very important. They focus on political representation. Political representation, typically in liberal democracies, is based on checks and balances of different powers. That is not particularly liked by populist actors. They prefer other ways of claiming to represent their people. And they do that through the charisma of their leaders. And they do that through the elimination of these intermediating entities, such as the trade unions, such as the media, such as associations of different kinds. What is particularly new is that they now also do that. In other words, they also reach their people through connections in supranational or international institutions, such as the European Parliament. And so we sometimes thematize the existence of a populist international, of people who coordinate strategies, ideas in international arenas and try to popularize them throughout the Western world. So this is what the institutionalization of populism means briefly. If we now look at the book in particular, all these elements are examined particularly in terms of the European Union. So different chapters of this book are interesting because they take the European Union as an entity that is being either vilified or glorified in a number of different ways, but they look specifically at what the European Union has done for populism or even against populism. And the picture that comes out is a nuanced, subtle picture in which essentially the European Union is seen as a promise to overcome populism, but then at the same time as an entity responsible for some of the populist shortcomings. So let's look at what different chapters do. Let's start with some of the chapters that more clearly look at the European Union. First, we have the chapter by Tully. Is an historical chapter. And Tully argues that the European Union failed to control populism and in fact encouraged populism simply by producing a blueprint of what the European Union should be that is intrinsically technocratic, elitist, and that doesn't really comes to term with the need for real participation. And he says that basically this has happened because at the beginning of the process of integration of the European Union, the democratic deficit was just not there as an issue. Basically, the European Union was not trying to cure a democratic deficit, which is at the root of the populist upsurge, simply because it was not perceived as a problem. The European Union was essentially a set of parliaments that had a functioning rule of law, proper checks and balances. And only with the expansion of the European Union, and particularly since the 70s, and the creation of the direct voting in the European Parliament, then the argument was made that maybe the European Parliament was sufficient to provide an avenue for representation that would cure the perceived democratic deficit. But in fact, this did not happen simply because the European Parliament never had enough power to address the democratic deficit. So the Monnet blueprint, which was essentially an elitist and technocratic recipe for integration, remained essentially there, and was something that the populists could launch, could strive, could reject. Another another chapter that also talks about similar issues is the chapter by Paul Blocher. And Paul Blocher looks at the way the European Union, among other things, has conceptualized civil society, and notes that the civil society is seen as good, as participant, as positive, as empowering. And that, he argues, is a very short-sighted and limited way of conceptualizing civil society. Because, in fact, that particular view of civil society is based on the idea, the normative idea, that the goodness of civil society is unquestioned, and that everybody who doesn't agree with the importance of civil society is basically undemocratic. Now, what he notes is that, in fact, you can support civil society, but from an uncivil perspective. For instance, not grounding civil society in positive, progressive values, but simply in a conception of the natural law. According to this conception, for instance, homosexuality is bad because it's not in the books, or because it's condemned in books, and so on and so forth. So an excessive normative understanding of what civil society is for the European Union is actually a recipe to give power to populists. And this is particularly the case because the lack of power of overcoming the democratic deficit of the European Union has been in many ways addressed by attempting to empower civil society as an alternative form of representation. But the point is that civil society actors are themselves often elites, and are not particularly representative of the population they claim to represent. And the mechanisms of selection of democratic elites within civil society is often not very, very transparent and clear. So, so these are two of the chapter, Tully and Blocher. I will skip Tully because we talked about it and time is running out. But another interesting and important chapter on the European Union is by Fossum, John Fossum. And Fossum again looked at the European Union, and like the other two, argues that the European Union is simply a construction that is not conducive to limiting populism. He says that the European Union is based on a set of entrenched ideas, a set of policy instruments that are unchanging, a set of approaches that typically are technocratic, a set of vulnerabilities that have not been addressed. And he calls this a segmented system. This segmentation is essentially producing a democratic deficit instead of curing it. It's a segmentation that does not allow, for instance, for proper representation, because at the horizontal level, institutions are not very strongly connected, the Commission, the Parliament, and instead they are connected vertically with member states, But as you go up the scale of governance from the level of national parliaments to the level of the European Commission, you basically lose that representation that is so important. So you remain with a very segmented system that populists can oppose. They say is disjuncted, is irrational. And Fossum also notes that this was exactly the state of several European states as analyzed by Charles Tilly in his historical work, and that process of integrating states that has created a viable citizenship and a proper form of political representation has simply not happened in the European Union. And this is another reason why we have a problem with populism. Other authors that have discussed this is Massetti, who talks about European integration essentially as stuck in this dream of glorified technocratic governance that, again, doesn't really give a proper voice to citizens. And maybe even the chapter I wrote with my co-author Carlo Berti also talks about populism and essentially anti-populism, reactions to populism, as something that has to do more with creating boundaries within the European Parliament, opposing different minorities, rather than really addressing the issue of the origin of populism and how to counteract it. So, we point to that aspect by showing, for instance, that populist actors continually define and redefine their enemies, and in doing that, they express that chameleon aspect that I mentioned before, without sufficiently creating a sense of strong cohesion within their opposers, simply because their opposers are by now using the same populist approaches. Populism should be conceptualized, according to several authors and Berti myself, as something that is gradual, rather than you either are a populist or you're not. You are a populist if you use a populist language, if you use a populist strategy, but everybody does it these days. And so there are no anti-populists that are not populists, or populists that are anti-populist. Essentially, it's just a differentiating strategy. We should be instead more clear about what our normative values are. I have only a few minutes to conclude, and I want to talk about two important chapters. One by Sakai and Masida. They analyzed the speeches of Merkel and Orban, and trying to see what is the essence of populism. And what you find is that Orban is very distinctive. Orban, as you well know, is an hyper-populist, and is distinctive in that he conceptualized political representation as protecting a particular constituency, that is his national constituency. And this protection is best done through eliminating debate and prizing efficiency that only a leader can do, only a leader that is unhindered, unstopped by the parliament or by others. This is very different from the view of Merkel, for instance, who looks at the way to fight populism through participation and transparency. The case study of Sakai and Masida are essentially the various measures that were taken in the context of the COVID-19 epidemics. And during the COVID-19 epidemics, Orban simply used the pandemic as a way of increasing his power and shutting down the opposition. Merkel did the opposite. So we see how populist at work really produces differences. Raffa and Mayo approach the same problem from a fairly different issue, which is, okay, what do populists do when they try to fight their enemies, who, as I said, typically are minorities, are particular views of gender equality, particular views of sexuality. And basically what they show is that essentially they don't talk about gender equality. Simply by not talking about it, they talk about something. They talk about something else. They talk about gender essentially in terms of motherhood. They talk about gender in terms of the absence of differences, to the point that in Italian we have different pronouns for the masculine and the feminine, and the leader of the populist party, who is a woman, wants to be called with the masculine pronoun, simply to make a point that excessive female differences are not acceptable. So let me conclude, but by just looking at what is happening now. Where are we now? Well, the best way to conclude, I think, is through an interesting seminar article by Schimmelpfennig, a recent article. In this article, Frank Schimmelpfennig argues that there are different kinds of crises. We often said, often we in European studies, that the European Union grows in crisis, that the European Union is like a bicycle. In order to keep it going, you have to pedal. If you stop, it falls. And crises are what makes it go, makes the bicycle go. Well, he differentiates two kinds of crises: crises that are simply crises that are essentially unforeseen and practical and can be cured by specific measures. And these specific measures are measures that are shared and accepted by everybody. And then there are crises that are more fundamental, that undermine the constitutive values of the Union. And he talks about the Brexit, for instance. He talks about the war in the Ukraine. He talks about the rule of law, because the rule of law is important in that there are different visions of what the rule of law is. Is the rule of law something that should be limited to the act of voting, and then representation taking place through a populist charismatic leader, or is something that should be done through checks and balances and power to the media and power to NGOs? Well, he says that this second type of crisis, constitutive crisis, are important because they create demarcation, they create opposing communities. But in doing that, they strengthen the process of integration. And he argues that this is what is happening now. And with him, I think this is exactly what is happening now. A real anti-populist group of MEPs from different perspectives, from different aspects of the right and the left, are now coming together precisely because the populists are so strong and demarcations are becoming important. And these demarcations are even more strong now with Trump, because Trump has created a situation in which it forces people to say where they are, in which particular community people define themselves. My conclusion is simply that populism is obviously here to stay, that there are different populist and anti-populist groups, and that often these populist and anti-populist groups are not simply rooted in political standing. They are rooted in conceptions of who we are, in the values. Typically, populism can be seen as a reaction to social disintegration, to the collapse of integrating factors in society, like, for instance, the mass party at one point, or strong association at another point. We need to recreate a sense of social integration. But we can only do that when we will have shared values, and this fight against populist viewpoints might be a way of starting this battle. And here I conclude. Thank you.